My work is primarily focused on looking at ways to bring ceramics into architecture. I worked for about 20 years as an architect, and after that period of time, really became much more interested in materials. And my training, even though it was traditional, was also based in computation. My education sort of overlapped an interesting period of time where architects were not being trained with pencil and paper anymore, but were really using the computer not only to kind of produce architectural projects, but to also become an instrument for design. So that influenced a lot of what I do from the standpoint of using the computer almost as a collaborator. And more over the years, computation has become a kind of dialogue between what materials can do, or the ways that materials respond, and the way that computation can take control or participate in that relationship with materials. It's always about a container, at least in liquid form, that one is pouring into a container, a liquid, and coating the inside of that container. And at some point releasing the container as a form, and then the clay takes the shape of that container. And the container is always there conceptually, whether it's the thing you imagine as a container as you're pressing the clay with your hands, or in the case of the work I do with the granular material, that it is a process of being contained by a surface and falling through a surface. Or in the case of slip casting, that you're literally pouring into a vessel and pouring out the liquid. The clay is actually being soaked into the surface just enough to form a shell. And at some point that porcelain becomes leather hard and you can handle it, which is a really magical moment to see it move from a pure liquid to something that is sculptable and can be formed further, refined. The other way that I've begun working with the material, especially on larger objects, is something called press molding. And press molding is a process of producing, again, a vessel, a container, and pressing slabs of clay that are pre-made, almost like sheets, rolled with a rolling pin like you would roll flour. And then the clay is pressed in and the seams are taken out from the inside, so you're essentially building a lining inside of a vessel. And some of the larger work that I've done, you're really working from the inside and you're pushing your hands up against the inside of the container and building from the inside out. And I mean, those are only a kind of like fraction of the ways in which ceramicists work with the material. Most of the work that I've done with the ceramics have been produced in Holland at the European Ceramic Work Center. And I've worked there over several different work periods. It's really the kind of premier place in Europe to bring different disciplines together, to look at ceramics from a different perspective and open up the dialogue about how the material can be kind of reimagined, let's say, but also looked at from really different viewpoints. So technology, looking at the different ways of developing the recipes and the qualities and the diversity of things that can become part of the ceramic recipe are really, really important to me. While a lot of the work that I do is produced digitally, partially, there's always handwork involved. And I like that tension between trying to keep things loose enough that you can see where the handwork is and digitally where the form has been designed in the computer. We like to think if we're working with materials, we have control over them. One of the things you learn very quickly with ceramics is you have no control. It's a kind of false precept, but there is a dialogue there. There are processes that I use computationally to replicate the behavior of what the ceramic would do under its own normal circumstances, in particular granular flow. And a lot of my recent work has been developed over the years of using granular flow literally as a kind of algorithm. It took many years, but what I started to realize is that the granular ceramic has a very set of specific properties. It will flow under a certain rate, it will take certain shapes consistently without any molds, solely through the flow of gravity, pulling it through a sieve, let's say. That produces a certain kind of formal consistency, but it's also something that with architectural tools and code, we can now replicate in the computer. So those rules that sort of govern the flow of the material are also rules that can be scripted, and they're rules that can be used to generate the process entirely in a virtual environment. I like the ability for the work to resonate differently with different people. The last thing I want to do with the work I make is project that there's a kind of ideal notion of what the object represents or what it should be interpreted as. Abstraction is a wonderful thing. To teach students to be able to see the world through abstraction is one of the most satisfying things that I've experienced as a teacher. It takes a certain amount of willingness to accept that we don't know what everything is in the world. And I hope to think that there's a kind of technological touch to the material that the virtuality introduces that fundamentally changes the way we think about the material, that we recognize it. And that's always been a really interesting kind of realization for me, that there are preconceptions about the way things should appear. There's just a kind of immensurate amount of variation and potential in things. And I think computation and technology is one way to actually bring that forward.